Thank you for joining us today. And today's topic with John Taylor is We Care, What Recovery Teaches Us About Caring for a Relationship. So I'll let you get started, John.
Thanks. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm seeing a lot of names that I have not seen before, so that's exciting. I'm John Taylor. I am a licensed clinical social worker in Salt Lake City, Utah, and the majority and their spouses and working with their relationships. So this webinar is an opportunity for me to share weekly some of the insights that I have come across in the work that I've done with relationships and addicts and their partners. And also an opportunity to celebrate with each of you the recovery that you're in its various forms, and for you guys to share some of your insights with each other as well, and to answer questions. So to start off, let me just finish typing in this question. We're going to start with a question, and I want to hear from you guys first, and then I'll jump into some thoughts that I had.
So he's putting that in the chat feature, so you should be able to see that on your screen.
Yeah, so I want you each to think about a moment in time where you were in a relationship that was working really, really well for both of you. So this might be a professional relationship with a colleague, with a boss, with an employee. It might be a family relationship with a sibling. It might be a friendship. It might be a romantic relationship. Think of a time where things were working really well for the both of you. And what did each of you do? Maybe share one thing that you saw yourself doing and you saw your partner doing that made that contributed to that relationship working really well. How did you?
Before you answer, I want to interrupt you. If you can answer, and you can answer to all panelists and not all attendees. So if you want to remain anonymous with this, you answer just to the panelists, and just John and I will see that. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to let you know you can answer that way.
Thank you. Thank you. So how did you feel about your partner during that time, and how did you feel about yourself? Just take a moment, think about that, can share some responses. We'll talk about them. You know, I think some of the best data or some of the best advice about how to make relationships work comes out of real relationships. Not so much, research is always fascinating. However, sometimes research is really hard to apply. And theories are just that, they're just theories, they're not grounded in anything. So I think diving into our experiences is really, really helpful. So we have one person who said, we both listened to one another, we trusted each other, we allowed feeling safety. I felt seen, heard, and valued. I felt my partner was safe. So for me, what this speaks to overall, and you can jump in if I'm getting off on this or if I'm off base on this, but overall, this speaks to kind of this overall settled feeling in the relationship. There's trust. I can talk and I know I'll be listened to. My partner can say what they need to say and they'll feel listened to. It just feels safe. Somebody else said, in my current marriage, we are partners. We support each other. I know he has my back and I have his. I feel supported and supportive. I really like the reciprocation in that. If I'm supporting, I know my partner's supporting me. We know we've got each other's back. And that actually that's one of the key pieces from the research that indicates how relationships can get through difficult times, is if that feeling of you ultimately have my back is intact, partnerships can get through a lot of really difficult stuff. So that's a really key piece there. Somebody else says, I have a friend in recovery. What I've enjoyed is when we have had time, when we've had to have conversation I would normally not have, and I was able to have them with her. And it felt amazing to say, when you did this, I felt, and to have her hear me and respect me. It felt good to me that she has done the same to me, and it felt trusting. It was nice. I really love those moments in relationships where it pushes into personally uncharted territory for us. This is really scary to talk about, but we're going to talk about that. And isn't that such a thing that we learn in recovery? If any of you are involved in peer-to-peer support like 12 Steps or Smart Recovery, you walk into a room full of strangers and you're going to hear them talk about some of the most personal things going on in their lives. And eventually you may get to a place where you want to share some of the most personal things going on in your life. I think being able to take those risks in relationships can be incredibly bonding, and it can go a long way to build trust. So if you have more to add here, feel free to add. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I thought of that we learned from recovery about caring for our relationships in partnership. So the last two webinars we did, the first one we called it I Care, and it really focused on self-care and how taking care of ourselves is an act of love and an act of caring for the relationship. Then we talked about You Care last week, which is how to support your partner in being the best partner they can be for you. And we talked a lot about clear feedback. We talked about making it easy for your partner to pass the ball to you, being open, being approachable, being direct, honest, things like that. So today we're going to talk about We Care. And the things that we're going to talk about today, they each have a personal correlation in recovery. In other words, these are things that we learn through either getting sober or healing from our trauma. So the first thing we're going to talk about is knowing the limits. What I've seen in my work with couples is one of the most, I would say one of the most reliable indicators of a couple's success in overcoming difficult things is they are committed to a timeout strategy. So what this looks like is when both parties of the relationship start to realize that they're really getting elevated or emotions are starting to take over, they've developed this ability to say to each other, hey, I don't feel like I'm in a productive place anymore. I need to take a breather. I need to take a timeout. And in a timeout strategy, we have a minimum of 20 minutes away from each other and not ruminating on whatever the argument was about, because our nervous system needs 20 minutes minimum to go back down to regulated. And that's 20 minutes without ruminating, without thinking through the argument still. That's a really scary thing, I think, in a lot of our relationships to do. I know as a parent, sometimes I worry about a full timeout strategy, especially if I know if my kid is in his room trashing things because he wants to get back at me. Or if that timeout means I'm putting myself in timeout because I'm not in a regulated place and that kid is going to feel alone. In a marriage, I think timeouts can be scary because it can feel like abandonment. I think in a relationship at work, a timeout can be scary because what's more pressing on our needs than our livelihood and our ability to make the money that we need to. And if we're having a conversation with a coworker or a boss and we say, I'm going to need to take a breather on this, there may be too much anxiety to walk away from that. So it's a very, I think, important skill, but it's a difficult one to actually get going. But what recovery teaches us is when we recognize our limits and we live within those, we have a lot less chaos. And so that's something I would encourage you to think about in your relationships. Something that both of you can add to the relationship, a strategy you can work on together that helps to care for a safe, supportive relationship is developing a timeout strategy. How are we going to signal to each other that we need that? Can we determine ahead of time what timeout means? This doesn't mean that I'm mad at you and I'm leaving. It means I want to be in the best place possible to deal with the stuff that we've got to deal with. So I've got to take a timeout and care for myself. The second thing that I think we get directly from our individual recovery that helps our relationships a lot is the ability to check in and the commitment to check-ins. Most of the folks that I work with early in recovery in their relationships, they have a hard time telling the difference between what a check-in is and what a visit to the principal's office is. And so they can feel really scared to have a check-in because they may feel like it's a form of control that their partner wants to exert over them. They may feel like it's only about what they've done wrong. And this is another really interesting thing that comes from the research around marriages that work. One of the 7 things that happy couples do, and it's really, really simple. It's so simple it sounds really stupid. But happy couples know what's going on in each other's day, even before the fact. Like if we're getting ready to, go out to work or school or whatever that looks like, and we say to each other, hey, what do you have going on today? And our partner says, oh, really boring stuff. I'm going to pay the bills and I'm going to do groceries. Or they say, I'm going to do the same thing I do at work every day. It really doesn't matter what the content of that check-in is. What matters is that we stopped and we asked, what's going on in your world? Because what that communicates on a micro level is I care about what is going to happen to you today. I'm interested in that, even if it's not interesting. I'm interested in it because you're going through it. And if you look at like in the workplace, knowing the context of our coworkers' lives, if you are an employer, knowing the context of your employees' lives, it gives you some additional insight into why you might be experiencing what you experience from them. If you know that so-and-so has a new baby and they're not sleeping and they're sloppy in their work, you may have some bandwidth and some grace to approach them in a kind, supportive way when their work is slacking, versus just assuming that they don't care because you know nothing about what's going on in their life, and you approach them in a way that gets them really defensive. So check-in is something that can really help establish bonds and create interest in each other, and definitely solidify that feeling that I have your back. So that's another really simple thing we learn. One of the first things that every sponsor I've ever had has said to me is, I want you to call me every day and just tell me what's going on in your day. And that works for building trust. That works for building relationships. So that's something to look at too in your relationship. If we don't have a check-in strategy, can we talk about what we want to know from each other? And it may be that maybe we don't want it problem focused, or we don't want it, how many times did you slip or fantasize today? Maybe we just want to check in on what's going on in your life today, so that we can communicate in that very simple way that we're interested in each other. The second or the third part of We Care is a sense of community. And this is something, especially in the 12 steps, the 12 traditions they talk about. The 12 traditions are all about how the community is managed and how the community comes together. I love the saying from AA that says something like, this is something that you'll do by yourself, but you won't do it alone. That sense of we're all here together and we're working on this together, and the sense of how important that resource is, turning the view from what the individual needs into what does the relationship need, is a really important skill in having a relationship that can care for the people who are part of it. That doesn't mean that our entire focus is on what does my relationship mean, because I've come to discover that for most folks, when their focus is on what does my relationship need solely, really what they're focused on is what does my partner want from me. And they're doing a lot of caretaking and not taking care of themselves very well. But it's very common in any kind of relationship that we can have issues that roll on for a long period of time without any resolution. And our tendency, especially if we're anxious, is going to be to push that to resolution, whether that's to appease and to pretend like it's not an issue for us anymore, or to heighten the issue and get it to blow up the relationship and make things end. So having a sense of community, the value of the relationships that we have, can help us to kind of check. So in communities, we share honestly. We're able to ask ourselves, are my personal needs paramount here, or are the needs of the community paramount, or is there a compromise between the two? So having a sense of community can help in caring for a relationship. The last thing that I would say is consistency. And if you've been to a lot of these webinars, you've probably heard me talk about consistency over and over again. I would say consistency has been a life-changing principle, life-transforming principle for me. The idea that it's less about what I do today, and it's more about what I do today and tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. And little actions really do build up into big results. So again, if we look at this check-in principle, and this comes out of the marriage therapy research, it's a really little, seemingly dumb thing that happens, but couples who do that on a regular basis, it's one of the 7 most predictable indicators of satisfaction in that relationship. So as with all things in recovery, for those of you in active addiction recovery, how many meetings did you go to where you couldn't establish sobriety? How many years did that happen for you? How many months did that happen for you? But did you stop going? No, you kept trying. We learn in recovery, if at first we don't succeed, we try again. And a lot of recovery is about getting successive approximations. What successive approximation means is that we are getting close to what we want, but not quite there. This is how we learn how to talk. When babies babble and coo, parents don't realize they're doing this, but they reward the babbling and cooing that sounds like words that the parent recognizes, and they ignore the ones that don't. And so that baby learns like, oh, this sound gets reward, and this sound people don't really care about. And so that's how children learn how to talk. We do the same thing in relationships with consistency, whether that's the consistency of feedback or the consistency of showing up and trying. we start to approximate what that relationship might need, and we get a lot of data about what's working or what's not. So don't expect that when you are working on the quality of your relationship that one or two things you do is going to change the tide. It's really about showing up every day, day after day, and just those little sustainable changes are what make a difference long term. So we had somebody else chat in when we were talking. They'd say, I've done this 20 minutes in the last week with my son. I took the no screen time suggestion, which we talked about last week, which is working with him, which was working, but I'm dealing with lots of probing to get it back the old way. And we're not getting to the conversation as yet, but I'm staying focused on the long term. Is this common in the changing phase? Absolutely. Relationships have a gravitational black hole, whether it's healthy or whether it's not. So we tend to go back to what we've always done. I call those the unhelpful habits. It's good to recognize that and know to break those unhelpful habits. You've got to have some escape velocity. That's where the consistency comes in. What I mean is, I'm guessing he's trying to get back how things were. Do others go through this? Does it pass? I would say yes, it does pass, especially as you're consistent with a new expectation, as you're consistent with a new approach, whether that's with your child, whether that's with a spouse, whether that's with a coworker. As human beings, we're wired to adapt to what's going on in our environment. And so if you're needing a change in the relationship or wanting a change in the relationship, change what you bring to the table. And eventually your partner has to adapt or they have to get out. And I think more often than not, human beings are prone to want to adapt and want to change, especially if they really understand there's not going to be another way around this. So keep lovingly holding that boundary, and I'll be excited to hear more what's going on. So any questions on the topic today, or any questions in general, you can put that in the Q&A section.
I was thinking about the timeout strategy, and I thought, it would be, I could see that being challenging to come up with a strategy that works for both parties, because, if my husband said, I need a timeout or whatever, but I'm highly anxious or whatever, and I could see me wanting to just engage and go, no, we need to talk about this now. Now, fortunately, I'm the one that's more up and down, and he's more calm. So, I'm usually the one that's going for a walk or whatever, just to settle. And then I can talk about things calmly after I've done that. But I could see that it could feel like abandonment or be challenging, and to be able to hold the space and go, he's just taking the 20 minutes. He's going to come back to me, and being okay with it would be a new skill. That would be challenging. So
yeah. Well, I'm glad you're bringing that up, Tammy, because I think the key part of a timeout strategy is that there's a commitment to when we're going to come back. So I'm totally the one in my marriage that when my wife is like, I'm mad at you, I'm going to be in our room and you're not allowed to be in there, I'm like outside the door knocking, like, I'm ready to talk now. Are you ready to talk? And it's like every 5 seconds. So one of the things that we've had to negotiate is, and she'll totally own that she's prone to, once she steps away, it's really hard to come back in. So we've negotiated that after 20 minutes, the person who called the timeout has to initiate some kind of contact with the other person and let them know, either I'm ready to talk or I need some more time. And so I can wait anxiously somewhere else in the house while she's grounding, and hopefully I'm grounding during that time too. But yeah, key to the success of that timeout strategy is a commitment to come back and revisit. And sometimes, depending on the issue, like I've had situations in the workplace where the issue has been so big and it's so tied to so many anxiety-provoking things, I've had to say, I'm going to need a week to think about this, and can we come back to this in a week? And that it's a very anxiety-filled week, but I think a lot of times in relationship, it's worth taking the time to get grounded and clear on what you need and what you need to say, versus going with a lot of anxiety or anger to just try to resolve the issue. Because often if we're resolving an issue out of anger or anxiety, we're just making that issue a perpetual issue. If we're giving ourselves time, often for me, what's on the other side of anxiety is some more vulnerable feeling, or what's on the other side of anger is some more vulnerable feeling. So a lot of the times I need space to feel that and to get really clear on all of what's going on for me rather than the anxiety of the moment.
I could totally see that, and it almost being like a Band-Aid. I'm going to stick a Band-Aid over this, and so we can go, oh, we're done with that. But having the unresolved and really having it, fester and become more of a problem in a bigger way. So, and we all have such interesting personality styles. So, so managing that throughout all the personality styles, clearly you and your wife and my husband and I, we have very different ways we attend to things. So, learning to navigate all of that is challenging.
Yeah. We have a testimonial in the chat. It says, I found the 20-minute timeout has helped me so much because I'm able to think better and articulate how I feel much easier and calmer. And I'm seeing the value. And I did the week 1 with my sponsor and going back, and it was amazing. I got a home truth, but I was in the space, I think that means a hard truth, but I was in a space to hear it. There's incredible value that can come out of every relationship that we're in. And I think the value has less to do with the delivery and more to do with the receptiveness of that. So good on you for trying that and investing the time in yourself and your relationship with your sponsor to become open to hard feedback. Those are sometimes those hard feedback sessions with a sponsor, with a spouse, with an employer, those can be very life-changing things.
Well, and I, wonder about sharing, I don't know, but I wonder about sharing that with your son too. Is like, I've done this and here's why I did it. And here's what I've experienced with that. And, I want to experience that in our relationship as well. And so that's why I'm trying this. I don't know. I know you're experiencing, you indicated you're getting pushback, which is understandable, teenager, et cetera. But to me, like, if you explain why to me and what hopefully the end goal is, it might be worth it. So, yeah. I was thinking when you were talking about, sponsor and check in daily, and I was like, yes, we do that. And I was like, why wouldn't we want that with somebody, our significant others, and my husband and I, generally, one of us texts each other during the day, how's your day going? What's up or whatever. But I also realized that when he comes home, and it's usually between 3:04 and 3:08, depending on traffic, and the dog and I are meeting him to greet him and find out how his day was and all of that type of thing. And, that's really an important part of my day is, just checking in with him and reconnecting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when we're in that curious listening space with our partner, even if it's about like, tell me about how the store didn't have the produce that you wanted. There's like 1,000 micro things going on with our body and our faces and our emotions that communicates a lot of care to our partner. And I think also puts us in a place where we're feeling the value of that relationship to us. He says they don't have sound.
Yeah, so I'm typing in, just check if your mute is on or if your computer audio.
For the rest of you, any other questions, you can put that in the Q&A. You can ask about anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be about caring for your relationships. Ask about anything. You've got me for the next 30 minutes.
Yeah, and I answered a lot of emails today from people that apparently had difficult weekends with partners. So I suggested that they join the conversation. So if you're new here, how this works is that you've got an expert therapist who's ready to answer your questions. If the Q&A is at the bottom. One of the things that John does, I'm going to tell you a little bit, is he works with a mother and mesh men. Since we have a few minutes, why don't you talk about what a situation could look like if you're in a situation with someone who's a little too involved with a parent?
Yeah, I actually just left a session with a couple who's been working on this. And he took the big step this week of restating the relationship with his mother, and he let her know that some things are going to be changing. And his spouse was talking about what a relief that feels like to her, to know that she doesn't have to try to manage the relationship with his mother because he's going to. But one of the relationship care difficulties that we see is if there's inappropriate loyalty to the family of origin, whether that's a mother, father, or both, what we can have a hard time doing is showing up completely loyal and completely present in the relationships that we're choosing. And it's a really conflictual, difficult place to be, because the vast majority of folks I work with around enmeshment issues, they have chosen people that they love and that they want to be with. But they're not free body, mind, and spirit to show up completely for that person, because they may still feel like, growing up, I took care of mom's emotions because dad wasn't available, and that's still my job. And that takes up bandwidth. I think that's another principle here in caring for the relationship, is recognizing there's a finite amount of energy to go around. It's not like it's infinite. So we make choices about where we put that energy. And oftentimes the spouses that I work with, they'll feel like they are second fiddle. They're last in the soup line, and they just get the leftovers from a partner who's giving a lot to mom or giving a lot to dad. And so being able to work on those issues around enmeshment and to experience separating from those parental bonds with love, but being able to have an adult relationship as an adult with your adult parents can really free you up to do some connecting and committing in a relationship that you haven't been able to do before.
I had somebody, and this was a while back, but somebody that wrote to Dr. Rob, through the site, and it was a woman, and her husband was physically going over to his mother's house 3 times a day, and she said, I don't get to have interaction with him because he's so busy. And I know that that's kind of an extreme case, but it was a really visual idea to me of somebody who was physically not able to, as well as emotionally not able to be there for the loved one, the wife, that he married, because of the situation with his mother, and how difficult that is to break. Because I'm sure it feels I'm betraying my mother.
Yeah.
I'm just using that example, but I'm betraying my parent if I, disconnect on any level. But I've got this other person here too. So
yeah, and unfortunately, it's not as simple as saying I'm a grown-up now and I get to choose my grown-up relationships. In the work I do with enmeshment and in the intensive workshops, we really work with them body, mind, and spirit, and experiencing that separateness, and being able to feel what it feels like to be your own man for the first time, and then going home and continuing that work to open up that space. It's not an easy thing.
So somebody shared or asked, please share more on mother enmeshment and sex addiction, and how the unfaithful can build safety if the partner hasn't felt changed by or with the family of origin.
Yeah, this is where we would refer to the double betrayal of sex addiction and enmeshment, because not only does the partner feel second to his affair partners or the pornography or whatever that looks like, they also feel second to the family. So often we'll see men get in sex addiction recovery and they can develop sexual sobriety. And they can even develop some decent sexual sobriety. They'll often be confused as to why their spouse is not happy with them now and why their spouse is still angry with them. And sometimes that can be because there's some betrayal trauma that still needs to be worked too. I often will look with my clients at what's going on with your other relationships. Can you put those in the proper context? Because what hurt your spouse is that they found out that you were not committed to them in the way that they thought that you were. And so if you're wanting to keep this relationship, it's really important that you work on how you communicate your commitment to your spouse, and that you feel free to give that commitment fully to your spouse. So a lot of times the partner's not going to feel safe until she or he feels like they're at the top of the list for their partner's important people. Which is, I think, what we're working towards. I think that's one of the main reasons why people choose a romantic partner and choose to get married, is because they want this to be their person and they want to be that person's person. And so that's a really important dynamic to address in order for trust to come back, because the betrayal around sexual addiction is addressed in part by getting sober, but it's really healed. That rift is really healed by learning how to do relationships in a functional way for both of you. And for a lot of the sex addicts I work with who also have enmeshment issues, the addiction causes them to not look at anybody else. And so in sobriety, they start being able to look at themselves. The enmeshment issue causes them to not be able to look beyond themselves. And that's really what we're looking for in healthy, connected relationships, is I can accurately look beyond me and what my experience is, because I'm not going to lose myself by joining up with your experience. I'm not going to lose myself by having a relationship with you. And that's something that the mother enmeshed man doesn't experience in his relationship with his mother, because she may have some overwhelming needs for him. And so when he joins with mom, her needs become his needs. Her reality becomes his reality.
Yeah, and I don't know, you would know better than me, but my experience has been that sex addiction is pretty easy to get to for mother enmeshed men, because it's unattached. There's no emotional connection. It's and I don't mean this to sound as dismissive as it is, but it's just sex. There's no relationship. It's just an app. It's just a prostitute. It's just whatever it is. And so I'm not betraying this relationship with my mother.
Well, and for a lot of the enmeshed men that I work with, it's not that they don't want a close relationship. It's that their experience in the relationship with their mom meant that closeness is obligation. Closeness is smothering. Closeness is I give up my identity. And so in the relationships that they build going forward, is they don't do the closeness thing. And that's not because they don't want it. It's because closeness was associated with all of those really difficult things. And so they'll look for things that are unattached, or they can attach up to a point. That's what I was talking with the couple about today. He was saying, we've started having really good conversations after our kids go to bed, but he said, it takes me about 2 hours to warm up before I can go deep. And then I'm exhausted because I've got to go to work the next day. And so we were talking about building that ability to remember the connection from day to day and not have to build it anew every time. But that's where a lot of enmeshed men are at, is there's a lot associated with being connected and close that doesn't feel safe. And they really have to work on separating that. And it's a very raw deal for partners of men who are enmeshed, because you're given two choices. Either you put up with a dynamic that's really unbearable for you and you always feel like you're second, or you move into a place where you feel like you have to nag all the time to get the attention that you need and to keep him focused on the right things. And it's a real losing proposition for partners. But there definitely are ways with the right kind of help and the right kind of information to navigate that minefield in a way that works well for both of you.
And you do intensives on this topic. So if you need more information, he'll type in his website information in the chat. So next question, and then I see there's one in the chat too, but we'll do the question in the Q&A first. Hubby is finally getting on track with SA recovery. Yay. What are your tips, suggestions for rebuilding the relationship, setting healthy boundaries, and rebuilding trust? We downloaded the Gottman's card deck apps. If you haven't read Out of the Doghouse, that book is all about rebuilding trust and very practical. Do this. So also any guides or resources to lead a person to learn how to properly treat others with respect. Out of the Doghouse. Hubby struggled with being emotionally, verbally, and physically abusive. He had a shattered upbringing in which all of these traits themselves are present.
Yeah. And this person's also saying they completed Out of the Doghouse, Sex Addiction 101, and Codependence, which are all really good places to start. I think any healing journey starts with accurate knowledge. And there are a lot of websites out there and a lot of people, I think, with good intention who have a lot of ideas about how to do this. However, not all approaches are created equal. Just introducing a new set of rules into the coupleship and saying, this is how we're going to think about each other, this is how we're going to feel about each other, this is how we're going to treat each other. Often that works well with couples for a few weeks, but then they forget it because it's not their story. It's not the mythology about the couple that they've created together. So I think it's really key here to have good therapeutic help, especially like in the rebuilding trust. A lot of couples' tendency can be, well, I'm really glad the betrayal's not happening anymore, and I really want to rush to the goal line with you and have lots of trust, but my body's saying no. So I think it is really helpful to have a good couples therapist who can help you navigate that dance of coming back together, especially one who can track what's going on in both of your bodies. Because again, when I'm in the room with couples, I think about 1,000 times more information is communicated by what's not being said versus what is being said. And that would be from the abuse side too. You mentioned that your hubby struggled with abuse and that kind of stuff. I think having a marriage therapist that can go to that dynamic and talk about it honestly and track what's going on in your bodies when this happens. There's if anger management or domestic violence courses are needed as part of that education, I think that's really important too. But yeah, I would say my strongest suggestion outside of the good knowledge that you've been getting is get some really specific marital help for navigating that stuff. The accountability piece is really, really good. But also there's going to be some skill sets. Empathy is a skill, and we see with people who are overtly angry or abusive, for many of them, they don't check their behavior because they haven't learned empathy, or they haven't learned it in a way that comes to the forefront of their minds. So empathy is a skill that can be learned, and that's something also that can be addressed in therapy is learning how to take in somebody else's emotional experience, their world, put yourself in their shoes, and imagine how they might be responding. And we find that empathy puts a lot of pro-social behavior and pro-relationship behavior on the forefront, and it moves a lot of our, I'd say, worst tendencies as human beings to the back when we realize that what we do affects other people who think and feel just like we think and feel.
And I was thinking, me reading a book once really is, I'm not stupid, but like I need to have things reinforced. That's why 12-step meetings are so helpful for me. Like you say the same thing a zillion times and I get it. But I was thinking with that, John has done all these webinars, and a lot of them are, here's 4 things you can do.
Yeah.
And so for me, like I'm taking notes while we do this stuff. And then the things that I want to incorporate, like I have to go today, I got Post-it notes all over my desk. And so for me, it's like, if I'm going to practice a behavior, it has to be at the forefront. Like the person was sharing earlier today, she is using the 20 minutes. Well, she was intentional about doing that. So any of these tools that you're hearing, they're not going to come naturally and, just all of a sudden be part of what you're experiencing. For me, I need to be intentional and go, okay, today, I'm going to do these 4 things. Well, or if my partner says this, I'm going to act this way rather than reacting like I normally do.
Last night we opened up a conversation with our kids. I have 2 boys, 9 and 6. And they're not always the kindest with each other, although they're like the best of friends. So we've really been focusing this year how we can like increase the kindness and consideration in our home. So last night we caught them in this moment where we could actually do some role playing, and it was fun. We had everybody name something that really frustrates them that happens in our family and how they don't respond well. And we had 2 other people play it out. So we asked, Mom and Dad were included. My wife asked, she's like, what's something Dad gets frustrated about that we could help him with? My 6-year-old is like, he's so mean when it's time to come to dinner and we don't want to come. And so I was like, all right, play it out. So he plays me and my wife plays the kids. And he got it right. He was like, if you don't come right now, I'm putting your food in the garbage and you're not going to have anything to eat. And I'm sitting there a little red-faced because I'm thinking like, yeah, he's got that. And then we went around the room and everybody made one suggestion for how that person could say or do something that was a little more kind, a little more useful. And the suggestion that my 9-year-old gave, he said, maybe if you could come down and sit by us and say, hey, in 5 minutes, dinner's going to be ready and I want you to be ready to come up. So wrap up what you're doing and then like give us some warning time. And I thought that was fantastic. And it was something that, it makes a lot of sense. And my adult brain should be able to conceive of that, but it doesn't. And so I needed help. So that can be another way to kind of build some of that connection and work on some of those issues. I think the key is when you're going to do that yourself, it has to be collaborative and it has to be a little playful. If it gets too serious and it gets too heavy, you're going to be prone to get stuck, and you might want to do that with the help of a therapist. But there can be some helpful talking one-on-one. Hey, when you respond this way to me, or when you snap like that, that shuts me right down. Here's something that might be more effective. Do you think you'd be open to saying that? There can be some of that.
Well, I love that. And now your kids got to be part of the solution, with that example as well, too. So everybody's bought into, let's try to make this different. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the questions that came up here in the chat is, how can I do that at home? That's not the first time we've attempted that. This is like 6 years of attempting this kind of stuff. And we just learn, by watching our kids and seeing how they respond to different ways of approaching them. So I'm all for everything's an experiment. Try it out, get feedback. I think it's been really critical in doing this kind of work in my family with my kids, is that we ask them, what did you think about that? And last night we asked them, and my 9-year-old said that was about 10 minutes longer than I wanted it to be. And I was like, all right, feedback taken. We can make it shorter next time.
So the person with the son with the 20 minutes said, is this appropriate to let my son call this? As I feared if I say to him, he can come back in 20 minutes, he'll just keep taking that and nothing will get talked about.
I think any agreement that we make in a relationship, accountability is needed. So again, you can try it out, and you might say to him, hey, you've got 20 minutes, and then I expect you to let me know where you're at. If it's been 25 minutes and I haven't heard from you, I'm going to come follow up with you. And for the time being, a lot of teenagers, I think, want to know that they have some power and some sway. So if he wants to put off an issue for days, maybe you let him do that. See where it goes. I had a teenager that I worked with as a therapist several years ago, and like most of the teenagers I worked with, his parents brought him and dropped him off and said, fix our child and our family will be fine. So he wasn't very motivated to be here. And I remember the first 2 sessions. The first session, he played nice. The second session, he's like, I don't want to be here and I'm not going to talk to you. And luckily I had already powwowed this with a supervisor. And so my plan was, I said, okay, I've got some paperwork that I need to catch up on. So if you don't want to talk, that's fine. You can sit here and enjoy this quiet hour and I'll do paperwork. So for a whole session, he just let me do paperwork and he didn't say anything. The next week he came back and he said, I'm still not going to talk this week. And I said, okay, well, that's fine. I've got some paperwork I need to catch up on. And it was about 10 minutes of me doing that. And he said, okay, here's what I want to talk about. And he opened up and we talked about things. If doing what you've been doing is not working, be open to try something else, even if it sounds a little bit crazy, and be willing to try it for a while. I think in parenthood and with any other relationship, we can get stuck in, well, I'm not getting the result I want right now. Sometimes we have to put that effort out or put a new way out of doing things a few times before we can really evaluate whether it's going to go somewhere.
In the chat, it says, I'm sober in SA and recovery, going well and doing the trauma work, but an area I do struggle with is sugar and food. I hear this is common in sex addiction to struggle with food. Is that, what's your insight on this?
Yeah, Patrick Carnes talks about how recovery is a game of whack-a-mole, and when you get one under control, something else will come up. There's 2 things that little kids have access to regulate their nervous systems. They have access to their own body, like masturbation, and they have access to food. So it's really common that when we're not struggling with one, we'll struggle with the other. And I've found success with my clients in approaching it just like we do with addiction, with a lot of compassion, a lot of understanding, a lot of what reasonable steps can you take this week to get more of the outcome that you want to get. And then a whole lot of, if I'm not going to use my regular things like my sex addiction or my food or my sugar to cope, what emotions are going to come up, because I'm going to need to know that I'm going to be coping with those. So it may be when you're not using sex or food to regulate, you may have crushing loneliness that you feel, or a lot of sadness. So having some strategies in place to be able to hold that sadness or that loneliness or whatever that is that's coming up. But yeah, that's a very, very common thing in recovery. And it's not a sign that you're hopeless. So you've got a complex problem that you're working to solve. So you just take it a bite at a time.
Haha. But what
I didn't even mean for that to be funny.
So I have experience with this. I've really struggled with food addiction as well. And one of the things that was critical for me was if I was eating something that was not the best choice for me, I immediately made it that I was bad. So there was good and bad. And I for me, had to stop doing that and be kinder to myself and realize that some moments I'm going to make better choices than others, and some moments I'm not. And it's not the end of the world. And, you know, it's been a very complex challenge for me to work through, and to have a relationship with food that, you know, is mostly good. Most hours of most days, I don't struggle with it so much, but it is complicated. And yes, it's really easy to numb out on food. And so for me to make choices that I go, like, why am I feeling like this? Why am I reaching for the whatever it is that's, you know, that I want? And how am I, it was like thinking it through. How am I going to feel if I eat 6 cookies? Well, I'm physically not going to feel good, and I'm going to have some shame about that, blah, blah, blah. What are some, you know, am I willing to do that? Then I can. If I'm not willing to do that, what are some things I could do that would be different, you know, that could change the direction of that? And it's complicated, and, you know, I can't say that, you know, everything's wonderful and rainbows now. It's not, but most hours of most days, it's not, you know, like it was.
Yeah. Yeah. That incremental change, that consistency is really, really important.
So in the chat, or in the Q&A, the description of enmeshed men sounds exactly like my husband, but he's not enmeshed. It seems like I'm trying to establish a connection every day, and I get so exhausted mentally. Husband is porn addict. Any advice? If he's an active porn addict, is that what we're hearing with this one?
If you could clarify that, that'll help.
Yes, because active porn addict is going to not be really available.
I will say here, something that I see really different between my porn-only clients and my sex addict clients is porn-only clients are far more avoidant than my sex-only clients or my sex addict clients. And porn is really set up to have a solitary experience that feels connecting and feels regulating, but is not in actuality. So sometimes that description of enmeshed men, I hear this from people a lot. This sounds like my spouse, but they are so avoidant of every relationship. It doesn't mean that if you're seeing that set of behaviors that it has to be enmeshment. It often is. I would say enmeshment, or what you may be experiencing with your spouse, they're both attachment issues, which have to do with the rules and the beliefs we have about how relationships work and how safe we are in relationships. And so it's really common, I would say, with the porn addicts that I work with, that they'll have a spouse who's dying to connect with them and they're trying to establish that connection. But if it's an active porn addiction and he's using, okay, so they say it's not active. Even if the addiction's not active, that's the neural pathways that have been laid down, is that he's used to regulating all by himself. He's used to going into isolation rather than finding connection soothing. And that's something I've seen with my porn addicted clients. They actually have to practice allowing themselves to be soothed in connected relationships. And it has much less to do with how their partner connects with them and more to do with their own tolerance for being close to other people. So if he's open and he's in therapy, that's something you could encourage him to work on with his therapist. I'll say from my early recovery days, I had a sponsor say to me once, this is really hard for you to sit here and be present with me, isn't it? And I was thinking, like, good sponsee. I said, no, of course it's not. And he's like, I can see this. I know this. This is me. He's like, you're sweating bullets. Do you need to get up and leave? I was like, no, I don't. And he's like, no, you need to get up and leave. And so he invited me to stand up and take a breather. And that was one of the best things that happened for me early on in my recovery, is I had somebody notice how hard it was for me to stay present. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, there's a lot that came up in my childhood and my attachment experience that made that experience, even with this really safe person, made it really difficult for me. But I've practiced that for years, and it's not difficult for me anymore. I can still feel that as my default setting, but I've got some really effective overriding things in there. So if you're exhausted from your trying to establish a connection, make sure that you're taking care of yourself really well and you're not extending beyond what you can do without harboring resentment. And if there's openness in the relationship or the ability for feedback, you might lovingly invite your partner to look at some of those attachment issues with their therapist and their support group.
It says not in therapy.
Yeah, that would make it difficult. That would make it difficult. So I would keep the focus on not exhausting yourself so much. Do what you can. Recognize that you're giving a gift and you're giving that out of love, but don't overdraw your own bank account to do that, because this is going to be a long haul, and you're going to need that energy in the future. Attachment issues are a long-term thing, so really look at the pacing for yourself so that you can give from a place of love and gifts, rather than feeling like I've got to give this now in order to fix this, because it'll be a little while.
So there's several more questions. The first one, what are some of the best ways to repair a relationship and establish safety after anger flares causing a rupture? Childhood trauma patterns of isolation and protection turn into long periods of stonewalling. How to work with this?
Now, just a clarifying question: if you're stonewalling or if your partner is stonewalling after the anger rupture, if stonewalling is happening on either side or for both of you, the antidote for stonewalling is being able to physiologically and psychologically self-soothe. So you might want to look at some strategies for being able to take care of your own nervous system. If anger puts you in a petrified, frozen place, you may want to have a mindfulness practice. I find moving is helpful. Somebody asked, what's stonewalling? Stonewalling is where you feel like your partner has completely shut off from you and is ignoring you. It often looks on the surface that your partner doesn't care. Really what's happening internally is they're having a lot of emotions and they do care a lot, so much that it's like all jammed up and they can't function. Movement in the body is really critical because stonewalling is a freezing response. So movement in the body helps to get things kind of flowing again. If we move from stonewalling into isolation and protection, that's kind of the ostrich head in the sand strategy. Like, I'm just going to ride this out. I think it's really important to develop some active coping skills to help keep the body fluid and keep the emotions moving if stonewalling is a thing. And as always, when it comes to anger, part of, I think, establishing safety after there's an anger rupture is to know that you can be safe in the moment when there is anger. So if that anger looks at all like it might be, there might be the potential for domestic violence or violence against you in any way, having a safety plan for yourself to get out of danger can help with some of the safety in returning. Also, in couples where there is big anger, one of the key indicators of the couple being able to work through that is that they can talk about the anger when it happens without one or both parties becoming defensive or stonewalling. So that would be another thing. If you're in marriage therapy, make sure that's something that's being talked about with the therapist, because it definitely can change. But it doesn't change just with time itself. It really takes some dedicated effort.
Yeah, and I was thinking a lot of it is having the discussion and having the plan when it's not active. It's like, this is a pattern that we've been doing. I want to make it different. What can we do? Having those. I love the idea of working with a good therapist with that. So what happens when they are both porn and SA? My husband says he's been sober since D-Day, but I still feel he's hiding.
Yeah. So porn and sex addiction is, it's a little more complicated than whether they're just sex or just porn, but it's also something that's very treatable and happens. I think the description that I'm hearing here is really normal. I think the more behaviors that were included in the acting out, the more betrayed the partner is going to feel. So when there's that sense that he's still hiding, there's a couple places I think that are important to look at there. First of all would be to look at, is my gut telling me something? When I work with partners of sex addicts, one of my wishes for them early on is they get to a place where they can trust their intuition again. Because when there's been a traumatic discovery or traumatic disclosure of sexual infidelity, people often feel like, I should have known this was going on, or how could I not have seen this? So the first place to look is there a reason for you to feel that way? And that might be something to talk out with a support group. If you're in marriage therapy, talk about that with your marriage therapist and your partner. The other part to look at is this an old response that my body is going through in order to keep myself safe? When we go through something that's really traumatic, something that's completely overwhelming to our nervous system, our brain and body put a bookmark in that, and they say, we're never going to let that happen again. So we can have hypervigilance. And that would be, again, something to sort out with a therapist or a support group. Is there enough in this relationship for me to trust, and I'm not able to because I'm having this post-traumatic stress response? Or am I really wanting to trust this relationship and make it work, but there's not enough here in order for me to do that?
So my partner is involved in long-term online affairs and fantasy. It seems really hard for him to be present. I have done my very best to be safe. He refused therapy with me. This one sounds like because it says my partner is involved, so it sounds like it's active.
Yeah. I'm putting in the chat the name of a book, Getting Your Loved One Sober, which in previous weeks I've shared a few ideas out of this book. It's based on the CRAFT intervention model, which stands for Community Reinforcement and Family Training. It's a very effective way at encouraging a loved one into change and into recovery that doesn't include overt confrontation, that doesn't get anybody digging in their heels. I would recommend resources like that, arming yourself with good information. One of the things that came out in the research with this CRAFT model as compared to other intervention models is the CRAFT model was nearly 70% effective at getting people into long-term effective treatment. And regardless of whether your loved one got into treatment or not, the people who used the CRAFT model felt psychologically more healthy and happier, regardless of whether or not their loved one changed. So sometimes we do run into that, where a partner may be unmotivated or unwilling to make the changes they need in order to make the relationship work. But that doesn't mean that you're consigned to a life of misery and that you have to orbit their addiction all the time. And Getting Your Loved One Sober has some really great suggestions and a structured program for starting that kind of renegotiating your life and working on renegotiating the relationship.
So one final thing, is there, on stonewalling, is there anywhere you can recommend that I can read more information on this?
The Gottmans write a lot about it. I think stonewalling is actually their term. So you could Google stonewalling and Gottman, Gottman. And that would be a good place to start. There's a book, and I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head. It's called Polyvagal Theory. I wouldn't recommend reading any of the clinical stuff about it because it's like dry as dry can be, but they just recently released a user-friendly for the public book. It's like maybe a half-inch thick on what nervous system regulation looks like and how our nervous system regulates. And that's what stonewalling is all about, is a very dysregulated frozen nervous system. So if you're on next week, I'll have the name of the book there, and that would be another good resource.
Well, thank you all for joining us. We are out of time. And again, join us next week. Oh wait, you don't have one next week.
Yeah, I'm gonna be out next week. It'll be the week after that. I'll be back on the 18th.
Okay, well, I'm glad I happened to notice that on the schedule. So come back on the 18th and he'll have that book and more information for you. But thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.